I hooked up with a stranger at a club, then she turned out to be my best friend's mom. I didn't go to the Blue Hour looking for trouble, but that's how trouble always introduces itself. Loud bass, cheap lights, and a grin that feels like it knows something you don't. I'm Nate, 23 at the time, freshly employed, freshly overconfident, and freshly convinced I was the main character in a city that didn't care. My best friend Owen had bailed last minute with some excuse about an early morning run, so I went alone, which already tells you I was in a questionable headspace. The place was packed in that shoulder-to-shoulder way that makes you forget your own name, and I was halfway through my second drink when she leaned in to ask if anyone was actually dancing or if we were all just pretending. She had this laugh that cut through the noise, dark hair pulled back like she'd done it without a mirror, and a confidence that didn't ask permission. We talked about nothing that mattered. Music, bad bosses, the universal lie of just one drink, and everything felt easy, like gravity had taken the night off. She said her name was Lila. I said mine. She guessed my age wrong and I didn't correct her. At some point, the band switched to a DJ, the lights softened, and the world narrowed to her hand on my wrist, guiding me toward the door like she'd done it 1,000 times and never once regretted it. I remember thinking I should text Owen, because I text Owen about everything, but my phone was dead and maybe that was the universe intervening. We walked through cool air that smelled like rain and cigarettes, laughing at something I can't remember, and I felt that reckless certainty that tomorrow would be someone else's problem. If I had known what morning was going to bring, I might have stayed, might have asked one more question, might have charged my phone. But I didn't. I followed Lila home, believing, for a few perfect hours, that surprises were always good ones. Morning arrived like a bad joke with a perfect punchline. I woke up disoriented, tangled in unfamiliar sheets, sunlight hitting my face way too confidently. For half a second, I was blissfully blank, no name, no context, just the warm, quiet aftermath of a night that felt like it belonged to a better version of me. Then I heard her in the kitchen, humming softly, the clink of a mug against a counter, and my brain started rebooting. Lila. That was her name. I pulled on my jeans, stepped out, and she smiled at me over her shoulder like this was normal, like I woke up in strangers' apartments all the time, and it never led to stories you couldn't tell your parents. Coffee was already poured. She asked how I took it, like she'd known me longer than 8 hours. We sat at a small table, knees almost touching, talking about hangovers and bad tattoos and how weird it is that the morning always feels more honest than the night before. I noticed things then: photos on the fridge, a kid in a soccer uniform, another at a graduation, all framed in mismatched magnets. "Your nephews?" I asked, because I'm an idiot. She laughed, not unkindly. "My sons," she said, like it was the most obvious thing in the world. I did the math too late and too fast, heat rushing to my face. She didn't seem bothered, just amused, like my surprise was part of the charm. "Relax," she said. "They're grown. I'm not robbing the cradle." We talked about work, about how she'd moved back to the city after a divorce. That sounded mutual in the way people say things to keep them neat. I checked my phone, still dead, and felt that small tug of anxiety about Owen, about the unspoken rule that we always updated each other. As I stood to leave, she handed me a scrap of paper with her number and a smile that lingered just a second longer than polite. "Text me when your phone remembers how to live," she said. Walking out, I felt light, stupid, and inexplicably proud, like I just passed a test I didn't know I was taking. I had no idea that the universe was already lining up the next question, and it was one I couldn't dodge with charm. I found out at noon, which feels important. Like the universe wanted me fully awake. When it landed the hit, Owen texted me a string of question marks, followed by, "You alive?" and then immediately called. I told him I'd crashed at a friend's place, which was technically true and morally questionable. He laughed, told me to get over to his apartment because his mom was in town and cooking actual food, which is how Owen says I don't want to eat cereal again. My stomach did that small, uneasy dip, but I chalked it up to caffeine and poor decisions. When I walked in, the smell of garlic and something simmering wrapped around me, cozy and domestic, and I had exactly 3 seconds to feel grateful before Lila stepped into the doorway with a wooden spoon and a smile that recognized me faster than my brain could catch up. The room went quiet, in that way where your ears ring. Owen said, "Oh, you've met my mom," like he was narrating a nature documentary. I said, Hey, because language abandoned me. Lila's smile didn't falter, but it shifted polite now. Careful. Morning, she said, and then to Owen, your friend Nate was very charming last night. Owen wiggled his eyebrows at me, completely unaware he was dancing on a live wire. I watched Lila's hands, steady, practiced, and realized she'd already decided how this would go. Lunch happened in slow motion. Owen talked about his job, his running, the neighbor who kept stealing packages. I nodded, chewed, tried not to die. Every so often, Lila and I caught each other's eyes, and there was a whole other conversation happening in that half second. Agreements forming, boundaries being built, a mutual, oh no, turning into, we can handle this. When Owen went to grab drinks, Lila leaned in and whispered, we'll talk later, like it was a promise and a warning wrapped together. I left early with an excuse about errands, my heart pounding like I just escaped a heist. On the walk home, embarrassment battled amusement, dread sparred with a weird respect. The night hadn't been a mistake, it had just been poorly timed, and somehow that felt worse and better all at once. I didn't tell Owen. That decision settled in my chest like a held breath I kept forgetting to release. The afternoon stretched on with that surreal aftertaste where everything looks normal, but feels staged, like I'd stepped off a treadmill and the room was still moving. My phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number, Lila asking if I was home safe, which felt absurdly considerate given the circumstances. We agreed to meet at a quiet cafe near the river, neutral territory with big windows and no surprises. She arrived first, already seated, posture composed, eyes alert in a way that told me she'd been thinking too. We danced around it at first. Apologies that weren't quite apologies, jokes that landed and then didn't. She set the rules gently but firmly. Owen couldn't know, not now, maybe not ever. Nothing like last night could happen again, and we had to be adults about it, which made me want to laugh and crawl under the table at the same time. I agreed because there was nothing else to do, because she was right, because the alternative was detonating my best friendship for a story that would age terribly. She surprised me by admitting she'd recognized my last name at lunch and pieced it together then, not before. That helped somehow, knowing it hadn't been a setup, just two lives intersecting at the dumbest possible angle. We talked longer than planned about boundaries, about how people reinvent themselves after divorce, about the weird loneliness of being everyone's mom, and rarely just yourself. When we stood to leave, there was no lingering, no loaded pause. Just a nod, a mutual understanding that this would be an inside joke we'd never tell. Walking home, I felt lighter and heavier at once, proud of us for being reasonable, and oddly sad that reason was required at all. I still didn't tell Owen. I told myself that was maturity. I wasn't entirely sure. The problem with secrets isn't keeping them, it's the way they start keeping you. Every time Owen mentioned his mom after that, my body reacted before my brain could catch up. She's staying another week, he said one night while we were gaming, casual as a shrug. My controller slipped from my hands. I blamed sweaty palms. Lila and I slipped into a new rhythm that felt both mature and absurd brief, polite interactions at Owen's place, texts limited to logistics like running late or parking's a nightmare, and a shared understanding that this was a sealed box we were carrying together. Then the universe, apparently bored, decided to poke it. Owen invited me to join them for a charity 5K his mom was running, because of course she was. I tried to decline. He insisted. I showed up in borrowed shorts, feeling like an extra in my own life. Watching Lila cheer Owen on, proud and loud, rewired something in me. She wasn't a punchline or a plot twist. She was a person with history and responsibilities, and a son who adored her. Afterward, sweaty and euphoric, Owen threw an arm around both of us for a photo. I smiled like a professional liar. Later, Lila caught me by the water fountain and said quietly, "You okay?" I surprised myself by answering honestly. "I think so," I said. And I meant it. There was humor in the absurdity, sure, but also growth in the restraint. We were choosing not to be reckless, and that choice felt like a small victory. When Owen asked if I joined them for dinner, I did, and we talked about training plans and dumb reality shows and nothing that mattered until it all mattered because it didn't explode. Walking home that night, I realized adulthood might just be the art of carrying awkward truths without letting them crush the good parts. I wasn't perfect at it, but I was learning, one carefully chosen silence at a time. The twist didn't come with fireworks. It came with a phone call on a Tuesday afternoon. Owen sounded off, that tight cheerfulness he gets when he's pretending not to worry. His mom had an offer back in her old city, better pay, better hours, and she was thinking of taking it. She asked what I think, he said, like the weight of the question was still settling on his shoulders. I said the right things about support and opportunity, while a selfish part of me wondered if distance would make everything easier. That night, Lila texted me, breaking our unspoken rule, asking if I could walk with her. We met by the river again, lights reflecting in the water like shaken coins. She admitted she was torn, excited, and terrified, proud of Owen, and afraid of leaving him. Then she surprised me by asking what I thought, not as Owen's friend, but as someone who'd seen her without the labels. I told her the truth, that she deserved a life that fit her now, not just the one she'd built around being needed. She laughed softly, said she'd hoped I'd say that. We stood there longer than planned, talking about choices and consequences and how sometimes doing the right thing still feels like a loss. And when we said goodbye, it wasn't heavy. It was warm, like a chapter closing gently instead of slamming shut. The next day, Owen told me she'd decided to take the job. He was sad but proud. I felt relief braided with something like gratitude. This thing between Lila and me had never been about crossing lines. It was about recognizing them and choosing, again and again, not to step over. And for the first time since that night at the Blue Hour, I felt certain that the story we were living wasn't a mess to be cleaned up, but a strange, human intersection we'd navigated without wreckage. I thought that would be the end of it, the neat fade-out where everyone moves on and the lesson lands softly. But life doesn't do neat. Owen spiraled a little after his mom left. Nothing dramatic, just late nights, skipped runs, that hollow humor that means someone's adjusting. I showed up more, cooked terrible meals, let him talk about nothing until he talked about everything. One night, out of nowhere, he asked if I thought his mom was lonely. The question caught me off guard, not because I didn't have thoughts, but because I had too many. I told him she was strong, that she'd built a life that included people who cared about her, that loneliness doesn't mean failure. He nodded, relieved, and said he worried he'd been her whole world for too long. That cracked something open in me. We talked about parents as people, about how growing up is realizing they're improvising too. Weeks passed. Lila sent a final text from the road. Made it safe, thanks for being decent, and that was it. No nostalgia trap, no lingering ache, just gratitude. Owen got back into his routine. I met someone my age who asked better questions and laughed at the right things. The story shrank to its proper size, a weird anecdote with a lesson tucked inside. Sometimes I catch myself smiling at the memory, not because it was scandalous, but because we all chose kindness over chaos. Turns out that's the plot twist nobody warns you about. Doing the mature thing can still be interesting, and it can still end well. Time has a way of daring you to confess when you least expect it. 2 months after Lila moved, Owen and I were back at the Blue Hour for nostalgia's sake, laughing at how the place smelled exactly the same and how we'd somehow aged 5 years since the last time. A few drinks in, he got that earnest look, the one that means a truth is stretching its legs. He told me he'd been thinking a lot about his mom, about how their relationship had shifted now that he wasn't her default plan. I think I used to need her to be just my mom, he said, swirling ice in his glass. But she's more than that, right? I nodded, heart thudding, wondering if this was the universe offering me a confession window. Then he added, she told me she had a wild night here before she left, said it reminded her she still got it. I laughed a little too loudly and said something safe about everyone needing reminders. He grinned, pleased, and launched into a story about a terrible date he'd had recently, and the moment passed like a train you watch from the platform, relieved and regretful all at once. Walking home, I realized honesty isn't always about disclosure. Sometimes it's about choosing the truth that does the least harm. I wasn't lying to Owen. I was protecting a version of him that didn't need to carry this. And that felt okay. The next morning, Lila emailed me a photo of a sunrise from her new apartment with a simple caption, "Settling in." I replied with a thumbs up and a joke about coffee quality. It was enough. The night at the club had become a footnote, the revelation a bridge we didn't need to cross out loud. What stayed was the strange confidence that comes from navigating a mess and leaving it better than you found it. The thing about unresolved tension is that it waits patiently, like it knows you'll trip eventually. Mine came disguised as a housewarming invite. Lila was back in town for a long weekend and wanted to host a small dinner before heading out again. Friends, neighbors, nothing dramatic. Owen was thrilled. I felt my spine straighten like a guilty dog. I considered bailing, rehearsed excuses about deadlines and migraines, then showed up anyway because avoidance has never actually solved anything. Her new place was bright and lived in already. Boxes half unpacked, music low and warm. She greeted me with the same composed ease, a hug that lingered just long enough to say we were fine. Owen floated through the room, proud and relaxed, introducing people like he was hosting a talk show. At some point, Lila pulled me aside, not secretly, just naturally, and asked how I'd been. I told her the truth about work, about dating, about learning to cook one dish well instead of 5 badly. She laughed and said she'd always admired how quickly I adjusted, which felt undeserved, but nice. Later, as the night wound down, Owen raised a glass and toasted his mom for choosing herself without leaving him behind. I watched Lila's eyes shine and realized something had shifted in me too. The story wasn't about the shock anymore. It was about the respect we'd built by not making it messier than it had to be. When I left, Lila squeezed my arm and said, "Thank you, for then, and for now." Walking home, I felt lighter than I had in months. The past hadn't chased me, it had nodded and stepped aside. I didn't expect the confession to come from Owen, and I definitely didn't expect it to come while we were assembling a bookshelf with missing screws. He paused mid-instruction, stared at the wall like it owed him money, and said, "Can I ask you something weird?" I said yes, because that's the contract. He asked if I'd ever hooked up with someone way older and not known it at the time. My soul left my body, did a lap, came back with snacks. I kept my voice steady, said it happens, clubs are chaos. Age is a guessing game under strobe lights. He nodded, thoughtful, then laughed. Good, because my mom told me she had a thing with a younger guy once, and I realized I didn't actually care. I almost dropped the shelf. He kept talking, explaining how it made him see her as a person instead of a role, how that was uncomfortable and freeing all at once. I wanted to tell him everything, to rip the bandage off and let the truth breathe, but the moment passed as he cracked a joke and handed me the last screw. We finished the shelf in silence that felt earned. Later, alone, I replayed it, weighing honesty against timing. The truth would change the story he was telling himself, and not for the better. Sometimes growth is knowing when your truth isn't the most important one in the room. I went home and slept well for the first time in weeks, the kind of sleep where your dreams don't argue with you. The shelf stood straight. So did we. I thought we'd stabilized into a comfortable normal when the last curveball showed up, wearing a smile and carrying a casserole. Lila invited Owen and me to brunch before she headed back out of town again. A low-stakes goodbye with eggs and too much coffee. I arrived early to help, which was either maturity or masochism. We fell into an easy rhythm in the kitchen, passing plates, swapping complaints about grocery prices, moving like people who trusted each other not to complicate things. She thanked me again for being there for Owen, for not turning a strange situation into a spectacle, and then said something that stuck. "You helped me see my son as an adult because you treated me like one." That landed heavier than she probably intended. When Owen showed up, flushed from a run, he hugged her hard and joked about stealing leftovers. Watching them, I realized the secret had done its work quietly. It had forced me to grow up faster, to hold competing truths without demanding a resolution. Over brunch, Owen announced he was thinking about moving cities for a job. Following his mom's example, she beamed. I teased him. The world kept turning. As we said our goodbyes, Lila hugged me and whispered, "Be good to each other," like a benediction. Walking out into the afternoon, I felt an unfamiliar peace, the kind that comes when you've survived something awkward without letting it define you. The story was no longer about what happened at a club. It was about who we'd become because of it. The last surprise came from me, which is how you know it was overdue. I realized, sitting on my couch one night, scrolling through nothing, that I'd been living carefully for months, mistaking caution for growth. The secret had taught me restraint, sure, but it also taught me to defer my own wants in the name of keeping the peace. That's a skill, not a lifestyle. I called Owen and told him I'd been offered a role at work that would move me across town, new team, bigger responsibilities. He whooped like I'd told him I was getting married, said it was about time I did something bold again. Packing up my place felt symbolic in a way I didn't expect, each box a small permission slip to start fresh without erasing the past. Lila texted to say she'd heard from Owen and was proud of me, which felt parental in the best, least complicated way. On my last night in the neighborhood, Owen and I grabbed a drink and laughed about old stories, including the night at the Blue Hour, edited and harmless, a version that didn't bruise anyone. As I walked home, city lights humming, I understood that maturity isn't the absence of mess, it's the confidence to step forward anyway. The truth I'd been carrying didn't own me anymore. I owned it, and I was choosing what came next. Distance did what it always does. It softened the sharp edges and clarified what actually mattered. My new place was smaller but brighter, closer to work and farther from the habits that kept me circling old versions of myself. Owen visited on a random Saturday with a six-pack and zero plans, sprawled on my floor, and declared the place dangerously adult. We talked about his possible move, my new team, the quiet terror of realizing your 20s don't come with a map. At some point, he asked if I ever regretted not saying everything out loud. I thought about it, about secrets, about timing, about the difference between honesty and harm, and told him no. Not because the truth was shameful, but because the story didn't need it to be complete. He nodded like he understood or like he was practicing understanding for later. That night after he left, I got a voice note from Lila Rare. Warm, brief telling me Owen sounded happy and that she was grateful our lives had intersected the way they did. I replayed it once, smiled, and let it be. The club, the morning, the reveal all of it had distilled into something usable. Not a warning or a brag, but a reminder that life doesn't always announce its lessons. Sometimes it hands them to you disguised as coincidence and waits to see what you do. The almost ending showed up when I least expected it because that's how life likes to check your work. Owen called me late, voice buzzing with nerves and excitement, to say he'd accepted the job in his mom's city. I congratulated him, meant it, and then felt that familiar tug of change pulling at old seams. We met for one last late dinner before his move, the kind where the plates stay full because the talking does all the work. Halfway through, he looked at me and said, I'm glad you were around when my mom figured her stuff out. I waited, braced, but he just smiled and added, You're steady. That matters. It felt like absolution I hadn't asked for. After dinner, we walked without a plan, laughing about future visits and the logistics of adult friendship. At the corner where we usually split, he hugged me longer than normal and said, Don't disappear. I promised I wouldn't. On the way home, my phone buzzed with an email from Lila. She'd landed another win at work, attached a photo of a plant she was keeping alive against all odds. I replied with congratulations and a joke about sunlight. No subtext, no ache, just people cheering each other on from different lanes. I slept deeply, the kind of sleep that feels like trust. The story was winding down, not with a reveal, but with continuity, which felt earned. I'm writing this a year later, mostly because enough time has passed that the story feels like a story instead of a live wire. Owen settled into his new city, sends me photos of bad dinners and good runs, and calls his mom more than he used to, but with less urgency and more curiosity. Lila sends holiday cards now, actual paper ones, with short notes about work, friends, the plant that somehow survived. I'm dating someone steady and kind who knows the story in outline only, because not every chapter needs a full reading to make sense. Looking back, the night at the Blue Hour wasn't a mistake or a miracle. It was a hinge. It taught me that attraction doesn't have to override judgment, that respect can be a choice you make repeatedly, even when the joke would be funnier if you didn't. And it taught me that parents are people, and people are complicated, and sometimes the healthiest thing you can do is carry a truth quietly until it's light enough to set down. If you're here for the shock value, I get it. I was too. But the real win wasn't the reveal. It was the restraint. We didn't blow up a friendship. We didn't turn a coincidence into collateral damage, and we all grew a little because of it. Not every wild night needs a wild ending. Sometimes the best plot twist is waking up wiser, still laughing, and realizing you handled something messy with grace.